Hello and welcome to fortune telling class. We're going to learn how to tell the future in this class. So this is 413 and we're not exactly going to tell the future, but we're going to talk a lot about the future this term. So a smidge of prognostication mixed in, I think. So if you're psychic, you're going to be very helpful in this course for the rest of us. Because for most of us, we're not actually able to predict the future, right? We struggle with that. There are times when we feel like we know exactly what's going to happen, and there's times when we feel like I know even less than I did yesterday. So if you're in that position right now and you're kind of tired of looking at your same old self in the mirror every day and saying, wow, I still don't know what's happening, do I? You better get used to that feeling because the older you get, the more that happens, at least in my experience. And it's not just the fact that you have to look in your own mirror constantly and find out that you know nothing, right? Like Socrates. Um, we have to find out that everybody else seems to be doing better than us, right? This Onion article sums it up. Report everyone starting a new exciting stage of life except me. I don't like social media, right? It reminds me of this fact. So what am I supposed to do? Well, you're probably tired of my advice by now. I understand that. So I'm going to give you some more. Get it together. Was that helpful? That probably wasn't very helpful, was it? Here's some specifics, okay? This is a poem by Ron Padgett called How to Be Perfect. It's actually a much longer poem, but we've just taken out a little selection of it, and he gives us a guide to how to be perfect. He says, get some sleep, don't give advice, take care of your teeth and gums, don't be afraid of anything beyond your control. Don't be afraid, for instance, that the building will collapse as you sleep or that someone you love will suddenly drop dead. Eat an orange every morning. Be friendly. It will help make you happy. Raise your pulse rate to 120 beats per minute for 20 straight minutes, 4 or 5 times a week, doing anything you enjoy. Hope for everything, expect nothing. Take care of things close to home first, straighten up the room before you save the world, then go ahead and save the world. Know that the desire to be perfect is probably the veiled expression of another desire, to be loved, perhaps, or not to die. Make eye contact with a tree. Be skeptical about all opinions, but try to see some value in each of them. Dress in a way that pleases both you and those around you. Do not speak quickly. Learn something new every day. Jen Dubois, I guess. Be nice to people before they have a chance to behave badly. That one's kind of key, isn't it? Perfection might be something to strive after, but it's akin to perfectionism, which is a poison. It's not always helpful, right? If we only take the perfect, we miss out on all the good, don't we? Well, here's good news for you. Your future is imperfect. And that's actually a good thing. And it hasn't been written yet, and that's also a good thing. If you don't like how it looks from here, you've got plenty of time to adjust it. And it's easy to be overly critical, right? And look at your past and say, why haven't things gone the way they were supposed to go, right? Or how did I end up in this position? Or why did my past self, ruin my future self already? It's easy to be overly critical. If you've only ever seen the beginning of a movie, for example, like if you've only read the beginning of your life story, if you've seen just the start of the movie of your life, it's easy to make premature judgments about the ending. And professional movie critics make this mistake all the time. For example, here's some real critical movie reviews of a film that came out a while back. And this is something that you might say about yourself, right? Like, this life, it goes on forever, right? This movie goes on forever. It's a collection of spectacular set pieces, okay, things look good, without any sense of momentum driving them into one another. The damn thing just goes on and on. This never ends. It's full of scenic splendors with a fine sense of scale, but its narrative thrust seemed relatively pro forma, and I was bored by the battle scenes, right? Yeah, I'm very bored by my own battle scenes in life. I still came away empty, wanting more, they said of this film. I was expecting something that I could get lost in, but instead I found myself wading through some things that were less than satisfactory. Right? Like, are we talking about a movie or are we talking about life here? The only thing worse than a bad movie that thinks it's a good one is a 3-hour long bad movie that thinks it's good. But then this person had a little bit more to say. They said, maybe it's too early to critique this trilogy when we're just getting started, right? However, if this signals the direction the series is going in, I'm not sure if I care to find out what happens to Frodo, Sauron, and those pesky golden rings. So, again, if you've just seen the beginning of a movie, or the beginning of a trilogy, or the beginning of your life story, it's really easy to be overly critical and say, what's the point? What's happening, right? What does all this mean? Do you listen to all that hate, though? Do you seek it out? Do you spew it out? hope not. Have some perspective. Having a critical eye doesn't just mean you tear into everything that's imperfect, right? It means you look for answers elsewhere, right? You try to find out what things actually mean. T.S. Eliot wrote a lot of poetry. He actually didn't write a lot considering how influential his poetry is, but he wrote some poetry. One of them is called Burnt Norton. It was part of a series of 4 poems called The Four Quartets he wrote during the Second World War. And this one begins, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, toward the door we never opened into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. There's something to that. All time is unredeemable. We can't get the time back that we've lost. But the end of it points back to our present. This is the only time you can control, right? We get critical of a lot of things. You might be critical of the last couple of years and how things have gone. And I understand you have a right to be mad about it because it's been terrible. And critiquing your own failure is one thing, but what if you're even critiquing your successes, right? Like young Michael Scott over here. This is a meme I made, actually. I'm quite proud of this meme I made a while back. My future self thanking me for saving so much money, and my present self unable to shop due to quarantine. I didn't mean to save money, I just couldn't spend it. Maintaining a long-term perspective forces you to think about things differently, right? And how do you alter your thinking to adjust to that long term? What exactly is your thinking, now that we mention it? When we're talking about thinking, we're talking about cognition, right? It's like the work that our brain does. So how do we work past and move past all those shortcuts and biases and paralysis of long-term perspective that System 1 has been forcing upon us for our whole lives? Because System 1, remember, says right now is what's important. But there's more important things sometimes, right? So how we're going to drive our motivation forward, how we're going to create willpower for ourselves to propel us towards our long-term goals. Well, one thing you can actually do is you can exercise. Not your body, silly, your willpower. Give your willpower a workout. How are you going to do that? Well, you make a training montage, right? Can you get it into shape? You know, I prefer the Rocky IV montage or the Karate Kid 3 montage. Either of those is great. Make your choice, right? Be thinking about that though, right? Like what drives us forward? Like what motivates us to get started? And a lot of times you might think, oh, well, I just lack motivation, or motivation is hard to come by, or I'm exhausted and I don't have it. And those are all part of the puzzle, but it's actually a bigger piece than that, right? There's more to it than that. So thinking about this week specifically, like what are you working on in your willpower, your motivation? I think right now, you know, week 1, spring term, this ain't easy to get motivated, right? Spring is like the second half of winter. You had a minimal break, poof, it's gone. And so we just have this like double term, essentially, right? And summer feels a long way away, and graduation might feel a long way away. So what are you eating right now? How are you sleeping right now? Are you getting exercise right now? What are your stress levels at right now? How's your growth mindset doing? We haven't talked about that for a while. Do you believe things can change for the better? They can change. Well, let's rewind a little bit before we answer the bigger questions in there. How was your diet, your sleep, your exercise, your stress levels, and growth mindset during Dead Week a couple weeks ago? Maybe not great, right? How has it been during quarantine as a whole? During this pandemic? Well, not perfect, to be honest. So a couple of books we've been talking about all year on and off. And one of them is Kelly McGonigal's The Willpower Instinct. And remember, this book is addressing the brain's 2 selves, 2 conflicting needs, right? Like, what is the prefrontal cortex telling me to do for the long term? And what is my limbic system saying I need right now to stay protected and be safe? And Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about, again, two brain systems, right? System one is that automatic thing trying to protect me all the time, but it can't learn and it can't really grow. And then system two that says, I'll help you grow and reach those long-term goals and find your future self, but hey, I'm pretty tired right now, right? We're constantly torn between these different cells that are just, it's our brain, right? It's a complex organ. And the end result of all that is we end up with limited willpower, right? We don't always have the same amount of motivation, right? And it tends to get used up on things. Ray Baumeister was one of the psychologists who studied willpower and self-control and motivation and all those related ideas. And he found out that self-control, depletes over time. It goes away, right? It runs out. And that's because every willpower act you do, so basically everything you do that's not easy to do, everything difficult that you do, draws from the same pool of resources. And once that pool is used up, you are no longer able to do difficult things, right? So if I go to work and I work a really stressful job all day, I've probably used up my entire willpower tank just to make it to the end of the day, And so by the time I get home, I'm not real motivated to get some homework done or, run some laps around the block or anything like that because my willpower is gone, right? It's like physically gone. And when it goes away, our emotional and physical and mental toughness essentially goes with it, right? So if you lack willpower, it's not because you're some kind of weak-willed individual, okay? It's because you probably already used it up on something difficult. So being able to have success in spite of that is extremely challenging, right? Like resisting temptations, trying to do the right thing all the time, all these things take willpower and they are exhausting. So the bad news is the willpower that you have, this ability to make good choices and serve your long-term goals, help your future self, is like a muscle. And if you use it, it tends to wear out, right? Like you use it up. But the good news is it's like a muscle. And if you use it, over time, it will actually get stronger, right? You might not have all the willpower today, but by using it, you will have more tomorrow and next week and the week after that. So think about your goals from this year. We've talked a lot about, New Year's resolutions, goals from the beginning of the year, career goals, financial goals, we're getting to retirement goals and all those kinds of things. Have you noticed when it's been the hardest to make good choices that serve these goals? Like, what kind of conditions are you under when it gets difficult? Are you tired, stressed, hungry, exhausted, upset, angry? Those are probably the times when you find out that there is no motivation to do these other things because the willpower is already gone, right? The toughest situations, people to be around, feelings that you have, all those things will affect whether you can do this long-term stuff. Typically, you're going to find out that there are certain places where willpower is the most limited, right? Like if you're an extrovert, you can kind of bounce off of people, right? And you feel like I can get, refueled by being in this sort of like public setting in many ways. If you're an introvert, you probably feel like I have no willpower. It's all drained after I was out with people all day, right? Now, again, some good news though is you're not a complete slave to your willpower tank because since it has a physical status in your body, you can actually affect it physically. So Matthew Galay, one of Baumeister's students, found that offering sugar to people would actually restore self-control and willpower. Sweet, right? Literally. Willpower can be physically influenced and physically restored. So if I literally am using it up because I am like burning calories, my brain is like burning calories to make decisions, right? Difficult decisions all day. Well, here's a Jolly Rancher. And all of a sudden I'm like, ooh, I guess I can study after all, right? It's not necessarily magic, but your willpower can be physically restored with energy, right? In this case, in the form of sugar. So that's good to know. We often think that the good decisions that we make are sort of abstract, or that all the decisions we make with our brains are abstract. And we feel like it's not so much that I have a body that my brain is part of, but that I have this mind that's like hovering over me and it's thinking things abstract and it's like, oh, silly body made of matter. I can decide this. I can learn this. I can do these things independently. But you have to remember that your brain is not just your mind, it's also the physical part of your body, right? And when it has no energy, your brain doesn't function very well. When you have no willpower, you might have to physically restore it to get it back, right? Higher blood sugar makes you more able to delay gratification and practice willpower. Gonigal found that from a study in Wong and Dvorak. And it makes sense, right? physical conditions of your body affect how you think and plan and engage with your future self. Lower willpower leads to higher risk taking as well. So what's a good willpower snack? Just like stacks of sugar you can have on your, maybe like fruit sugars or something. I don't know, I'm not a nutritionist. You can also help yourself out with your mental work in other ways as well. Part of that is actually through physical work. If your goal that you're trying to achieve looks too difficult, you can actually do something else to try to make it easier. Rather than working on the goal directly, you can also work on practicing your willpower, like actively resisting things, like doing things that are difficult by choice. Like maybe you go around and you switch hands for things, like you start brushing your teeth with your left hand if you're right-handed or something like that, right? These things require like brain power and they're difficult to do, but by doing these difficult things, you actually increase your future willpower pool. It's also by committing to things. So even if it's a very small thing, like I want to meditate 5 minutes a day, or I want to call my mom every other day or something like that, having that regular action that you have to take on a regular basis will also increase your willpower over time. So it doesn't have to be these big dramatic things necessarily that make it easier for us to plan for the future, but you might have to do something, right? But it's tempting to say, well, maybe this is just who I am, right? Like I've always been like this. This is the amount of willpower I have. This is the amount of energy I have. This is life, and it's like exhausting to me. And it's true. I understand that. But Daniel Kahneman and his longtime research partner Amos Tversky studied the idea of what became known as the availability heuristic. And basically, this is something that System 1 uses all the time. It says, I'm going to give you an answer based on what I know and what's present to me, what's familiar to me, and what's available to me. And so as soon as we say, I don't have any willpower, I'm exhausted, I have all these jobs I have to do, and the world is unfair. It's like, all that stuff can be true, but that's not necessarily the end of the story, okay? And so what does the availability heuristic say about that? It basically says this. When we try to think of something, like if we are told, internally, to recall something, we find like the thing that seems to best represent that category, right? And then we weight that thing importantly. Like if somebody asked you, like, think of a red thing, there are probably a number of red things you could think of that would, very quickly come to mind, right? I might think of like a tomato or something, right? Like it's very, much in that red zone. It's very available to me. I had a tomato like a couple days ago, thinking about tomatoes, right? It's very red, it's very familiar, it's available to me. If somebody said, think of a red thing, I wouldn't necessarily think of like, so it's even hard to come up with a hard example. Like I wouldn't necessarily think of something like lava or something, right? Because I don't see lava on a daily basis. I don't live in Hawaii, right? It's not as available to me, but a red tomato, that's available to me. It's in the fridge, right? Think about it this way. If somebody asked you, like, what are the most dangerous plants in the world? You would say not necessarily the plants that were most dangerous, but the plants that you were familiar with that were dangerous, right? Now, we don't know the most dangerous ones. So let's do a little quiz about that. Which of the following of these items that will show up in just a second poses the greatest threat to the safety and value of people's homes and properties, do you think? Is it floods, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, or finances? What do you think is the biggest threat to your home and property from this list? Okay. Well, a lot of it really has to do with substitution, right? Once again. Like, I don't know the answer. Is it floods? Is it fires? Is it finances? Maybe. We'll probably answer the thing that's most familiar to us. So if we're most familiar with financial problems, we'll probably say, oh yeah, finances is a big threat. If we just survived a flood, we might say, yeah, floods are a big threat, right? So whatever's available to us, we take that to be the truth, okay? And we make the substitution between what is the actual probability mathematically of a disaster happening, and we say instead, yeah, I don't know, fires seem kind of rough, right? I wouldn't want to recover from a fire. So the things that end up getting stuck in our heads the most, that answer our questions the wrong way, are things that are frequent and recent, right? The most familiar. Things that are salient, right? Remember salient things? Things that jump out at us. Things that are dramatic, hard to forget. personal experiences. I saw this flood, it's real to me. So here's a personal question. Do you trust the government or the police more now than you did a year ago or a couple years ago? Do you trust them less? Why? And the way that you answer that question has a lot to do with availability, like what you've experienced personally, what you've seen, what's been salient to you, what you've remembered. Oh, there's our lion salient once again. Good to see you. And if you had a lion jump out at you, that would probably be on your list of dangerous things. So one crucial concept we have to think about when you're trying to change something about your life or plan for the future is what is available to me right now? What's going to be constantly in my face for good or for bad? Resisting biases becomes a really tiring, constant chore. It's not something you can do like every second of every day because you will run out of willpower. Think about it this way. Here's an example for you. One availability bias that you might run into at some point in your life is that partners or spouses, people in relationships often believe that they are doing more work in the relationship, in the house, at work or whatever it is than their partner. And the reason why is because our own efforts are more available to us than the other person's. So I can say to my wife like, oh, excuse me? I went to work all day, and I don't do much, do I? No, I used to do all the laundry. I'd be like, I do all the laundry, But now she could be like, well, now I'm doing the laundry, I'm doing the dishes, like I'm taking out the trash and stuff, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I guess you are. It's like we note the things that we do, we don't note the things very well that other people do, and that actually can shred relationships, among other things. But you can work on that. You can make it a little less likely that you'll fall into this availability bias. Norbert Schwartz studied this, and he found that listing examples of things that you do and that other people do will actually help you see them more frequently, right? So if I write down, examples of when I've done X, Y, Z, or examples of the types of work that I do, will allow me to actually see what we both do a little more frequently. Because again, that's making it easier for us to recall these things. It's making these items more available to us, right? So you have to be careful when you say like, there's no way out, there's no hope for this thing. A lot of that could be availability bias talking to us, right? And recency bias. And the fact is there could actually be some way out. In Schwartz's experiments, this is another sort of interesting facet of it. People that listed, 12 examples of when they were more assertive actually ended up believing that they were less assertive than people who didn't list as many examples. Why do you think that might be the case? Because you'd think like the more examples I put down of an action happening, the more I would believe it's true of me, right? Well, it's because it's easy to find a few good examples. It's hard to find like 12 good examples, right? And so after a while, you end up with this weaker list, and you're like, maybe I'm not so assertive after all. There's a paradox involved. Sometimes the more you note something, the less you think you actually do it. Can't trust anything, can we? Also, like your emotional state will change it, and not even your emotions, but your actions, your physical state. Like if you physically smile, this is like my robot smile, the less you'll actually be able to come up with examples of these things, which is even weirder if you think about it. Like how is this connected to this? But it's connected. Think about it this way too, like students who write the most about like problems with their classes or things they would like to improve tend to actually give classes higher ratings on their quality. I guess they think that there's hope, right? So be careful about trusting system one. Just because something's available to you, just because you make these lists of what appears to be true right now, doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to get closer to your goal. If we believe, that it's hard to think of examples, we tend to think that they don't exist. But if we think of way too many examples, we think that they're just pointless as well. And so if I can't find good examples of myself like finding success in the past, it can be really easy to say, I don't know if I'm going to be successful in the future, right? Or if all my successes seem really like this long minor list, I might feel like I'm just defrauding myself, right? I'm never going to make it. Schwartz found out that you can interrupt that kind of thinking though. Judgments and beliefs are not so much influenced by how easy they are to retrieve or how available they are, if you can interrupt it with something. Like for example, if you play music in the middle of listing these examples of qualities about yourself, and if they're told that the music will actually help them, like they end up with better results. Oh, wait, they get the same ones if you tell them it's bad for them. So what does that mean? It means any interruption could be a good thing. So if you've been on a long streak of thinking about how bad school is and how hard it is to find a job and all these other things about the future that you can't control, you got to interrupt that thinking a little bit, right? The more you make that kind of thinking available to yourself, like the harder it's going to be to believe otherwise. But if you can interrupt it with anything, like playing a guitar or something, it's going to help a little bit, okay? And a lot of this is the result of us having these multitude of systems in our brain that are constantly in conflict. We have system one that's just trying to help us get by day to day, and then system two, which says, yeah, but what about the future? What am I going to need tomorrow? If you're constantly in system one mode, you're always sticking to your past answers. You're sticking to what's available, what you already know. You're substituting easy questions for difficult ones. It's going to be really hard to change and actually thrive in the future. But if you give system two a chance, if you try to build up that willpower pool a little bit, give it some tools to be able to make good decisions for you, you might get past some of those biases, right? It's tough though. It's not easy, but it is possible. So when are you going to struggle the most? Well, system one is going to take over a lot of times. It's going to take over when we're doing something that's difficult, or we're just happy. We don't really want to think critically about things. Or when we score low on a depression scale, right? Depression leads to more system one thinking. If we are knowledgeable novices, which basically means like we don't really know what we're talking about, we know a little bit, we tend to make quick judgments with system one and not necessarily think about the complexities and the gray areas and all that other stuff that exists out there. If we score high on a scale of faith and intuition, so basically for somebody that says, no, I go with my gut, like I trust my gut, it means system one is running your life. You have to be really careful about your intuition. If you're feeling powerful, that Rocky montage, right? Or if somebody makes you feel powerful, you won't tend to make as good of decisions. Which explains a lot about people who are in power, doesn't it? What do these things all have in common? A lot of it really is the present versus the future, right? I found this memory on my Facebook from a dozen years ago. And I said at that time, I always imagine that in the future I'll have more time, but I'm always disappointed. And it's still true today. I always think I'm going to have more time in the future. And it's like, no, friend. Your time has gone. You have to make time if you need it now. What I also like about this is that my cousin, Steve, liked it. He has the same name as me. I'm Steven Summers. He's Steve Summers. I'm not actually named after him, though. But he is considerably older than me. Nice guy, too. He reads my books. So it's kind of like, weirdly, my future self is looking at my present self, talking about my past self. And it's going to be a lot of that this term. Mindless actions we also have to be careful of, right? System one is the king or the queen of mindless actions. Mindless choosing is basically like times when we go on autopilot, right? Like in the future, at some point, you are going to drive to work by accident on the weekend. It's going to happen when you're trying to go somewhere else. Brian Wansink studied this phenomenon, and he did it in a weird way. He studied an experiment where he used popcorn, and he gave people stale popcorn, like 5-day-old popcorn that's like, this is not fresh, this is not great. And he gave people, some people got bigger buckets than others, and the people who had bigger buckets ate 53% more popcorn than those who got smaller buckets. And afterwards, everyone denied that the size of the bucket had influenced their eating, but 53% more seems like it might have influenced them, right? Just the shape of the bucket makes us eat more. Wansink did another study, just like to mess with people. And he gave people bowls of tomato soup, and he told people to eat, as much soup as they liked. And secretly underneath, the soup bowls were being refilled constantly, which with tomato soup, you could actually see like getting away with that because it's just like the same sort of opaque red shade, right? Oh, there's another red thing I could have thought of, tomato soup, not just tomatoes. So the bowl never actually emptied because it was being refilled slowly as they were eating it. And most people continued to eat during the entire experiment, not realizing that they were eating multiple bowls of soup. But hey, free soup, right? So that shouldn't hopefully scare you. It just means like there are tons of things we do on autopilot, right? Like if we don't sit and like are forced to think about the world and the universe and our futures, like we don't use system two, we use system one. System one says, hey, free soup. So if you're trying to get more self-control, if you're trying to like motivate yourself towards a certain goal or think about your future self or achieve those New Year's resolutions that we have long since abandoned, um, you can do certain things, right? You can make lists, you can set alarms, you can ask people for help and all that things. One thing that actually helps a lot is financial incentives. Like if you tax yourself in some way and say, I'll have to pay out XYZ reward if I don't do this thing, you'll probably do it. We feel the pain of losing money. Governments can do this too. They can tax things they don't like. They do it all the time, which makes us feel like we live in a nanny state, right? But it's because they're trying to encourage certain kinds of behavior. But you can do it yourself, even if the government doesn't, right? Like if you smoke a cigarette and you're trying to stop, like make yourself put money into a health savings account every time you do that, right? Like your brain at some point might say, okay, I get it. Sometimes it helps to have choices made for us, right? So we don't have to have system one constantly trying to make choices and not necessarily succeeding. If you have too many choices, you can also be overwhelmed by it, right? There's choice paralysis, there's willpower exhaustion. All those things we do cost something. Like there's no free actions out there, right? Especially difficult and important actions are not free. They have a cost. Sometimes choice architecture systems help us with this, right? If I have money being automatically deducted each month in savings, to go into a retirement account, I don't have to fight that willpower fight each month, right? It's just going to happen. Or if I just, force myself not to walk by the coffee shop I'd like to stop at every single day, like it's just going to be that much harder for me to get there, right? And maybe I'll be less likely to do it. Maybe that will help me out without having to feel like I'm having this big internal struggle for, I desperately need caffeine. What else is available to you? The easier you make good things and the harder you make bad things to do, like the less willpower is going to be used up in the process, right? And one way to do this as well is to keep yourself accountable. If you track a behavior, if you're trying to change something in your life, write it down when you do it, write it down when you don't do it. And either way, it will make you more likely to do that thing in the future. Because if you force yourself to track your behaviors, you will become conscious of them and you will incorporate them into your life. If you don't ever do that, it's really easy to say, I just didn't feel like running today, right? Hey, I ran this morning and I did not want to run. And I was so tired. And now I'm even more tired, but I did run. Find patterns and insights and solutions, okay? Find things that help you. And they're going to be different than everybody else, right? And you don't have to share this with anybody else. This is not a task you have to do for this class or any other class. This is just for you and your future self, okay? But the more you make change available and salient and right there in front of you, the more likely it is that some of these things might actually happen. So we have one last book that we're going to bring into this series here in 413, and this one is by Viktor Frankl, which you might have heard of him before, or the book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist, he survived the Holocaust, and he was something of an existentialist in his philosophy. And he wrote a lot about how those three things combine, basically. And so in this book, that's basically what it's about. It's an autobiographical account of him in concentration camps, including Auschwitz during World War II. And he talks about his idea of logotherapy, which is basically a psychology of trying to find meaning in life. And so that's kind of the premise of the whole book. It's like, can you find meaning in life even when it's pretty iffy? So he wasn't the first existentialist philosopher. Kierkegaard, you might know of. He talked about sort of the separation of the individual and the crowd. You might have heard about Sartre before. In his line, existence precedes essence, which is sort of a foundational point of existentialism, which means like it's more important to be than to do, right? Or like what your actions are, whatever, are less important than you fundamentally. A few key terms here. We're not going to focus on facticity today, but alienation, right? There's separation between myself and the group, it feels like, or I feel outside of society, or where is my place in this whole space? And authenticity. So you might think, if you're trying to connect with this, about something like Catcher in the Rye, if you've read that book. And that whole book is basically Holden saying, like, everything out there is either phony or it's real. It's authentic or it's a fake. And he wanted to find, like, the authentic things, right? And that's sort of the existentialist philosophy in some ways as well. It's like, what is the thing that is real out here? It's not like these actions that you do. It's not your job. It's not what other people think about you and all these things. It's something else. And then, of course, there's anxiety that ties into that as well, right? Because it's this feeling you're unsettled, right? If you're not part of the crowd, you have to actually think about why that is the case. And then the absurd, which we're not going to spend a lot of time with, but you might consider this course to be absurd on some levels, and I would thank you if you think so, because I find that a compliment. But Frankl's version of existentialism, he kind of sums up in different terms. He says, to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering. If there is a purpose in life at all, there must be a purpose in suffering and dying. But no man can tell another what this purpose is. Each must find out for himself and must accept the responsibilities that his answer prescribes. If he succeeds, he will continue to grow in spite of all indignities. That's a very loaded paragraph right there. And I think you can parse that however you want, right? You don't have to believe that. I don't even know if I completely believe that. But it's provocative, and it's interesting to think about that idea, right? What is the purpose in life? Is there purpose in all life or just some of it? And he says there's even purpose in suffering, of all things. John Hughes also had a version of existentialism that he put into his film The Breakfast Club, which you might remember your parents watching at some point or something. One of the characters, Andrew, says, "My God, are we going to be like our parents?" Clara says, "Not me, ever." Allison says, "It's unavoidable, it just happens." What happens? When you grow up, your heart dies. So who cares? I care. I think we all care, don't we? So don't grow up. Don't give up. Everybody fails. You got to keep going anyway. The goals that you're chasing are your goals, not mine. Improve your motivation and willpower, and your future self might actually become real. Control the only part of the future you can control, present you right now. And remember these words, because they'll come back to you. We're a working title for a really long book. And if it came too easy, it wouldn't be worth all the time that it took. Have a good term. We'll talk to you next week.